in all these Grand Prix tournaments that I was afraid of my own shadow. Yeah, for me, that's why I came to Paris. Yeah, it's a day of judgment.
Paris was the grand finale of the 1994 Intel World Series. The three clear favourites to win the Grand Prix were Moscow winner Viswanathan Anand, New York winner Vladimir Kramnik, and London winner Vasily Ivanchuk. Kramnik was just 1 point ahead of Ivanchuk and Anand, who were tied for second. World champion Garry Kasparov had only an outside chance of claiming the overall Grand Prix. To achieve his goal, not only would he have to win in Paris, where Grand Prix points counted double, but he would have to trust that none of his main rivals would even reach the final. The first round saw the beginning of a miracle. After all the tension of the London victory, Vasily Ivanchuk's nerves finally failed here in Paris. His first-round opponent, Ilya Smirin from Israel, held him to 2 uneventful draws, which brought them to the lottery of the shootout. Ivanchuk won the toss and selected the black pieces, meaning that a draw would be enough to send him through, though in accordance with the shootout rules he would only start with 5 minutes to Smirin's 6. It was clear that the Ukrainian felt ill at ease from the opening, and as he dawdled nervously, both his position and his time began to deteriorate. Under extreme pressure, he simply froze. He might have been playing a postal game. Smirin couldn't believe his luck. He had only to make legal moves for Ivanchuk's time to run out. And as it was, he even landed a killer punch. Ivanchuk had blown it. With Kramnik and Kasparov in the top half of the draw, and Ivanchuk now out of the tournament, Vishy Anand's path to the final looked relatively clear. However, his first-round opponent, Anatoly Vaisa, a Russian émigré now resident in Paris, had other ideas. Vaisa came out on top in a theoretical duel in the first game, so Vishy found himself in a must-win situation in the second. Anand opened with his customary pawn to e4. Vaisa played c5, then knight f3, e6. First few moves absolutely normal. Sicilian defence. Black captured on d4, white recaptured. Vaisa played knight f6. Anand defended the pawn with knight c3, and then came knight c6. Now this is Vaisa's normal opening. It's inviting white to play into the highly complex Sveshnikov variation, which would begin with knight to b5, then d6, and bishop f4, e5, and bishop g5. Very complicated, and Vaisa is a specialist in that opening. Anand thought he was being clever when he played his pawn to g3, just to sidestep all those complicated variations. But in fact, as Vaisa revealed afterwards, he had prepared his next move specifically for this tournament. He played his queen out to b6, attacking the knight on d4. Very aggressive move. Anand captured on c6. Vaisa recaptured with the b-pawn, so that strengthens his centre and opened the b-file. We'll see in a moment how critical, how crucial that is. And now Anand pushed on with his pawn to e5. Then came knight to d5. And now Anand made a mistake. He played his knight into e4, which on the surface of it looks fine, just looking at that slightly weak d6 square. But then came a real shocker. Queen b4 check, attacking the knight, and of course checking the white king. So the knight was forced to come back to d2. And then came another excellent move, really rather surprising. Black's queen came to d4, attacking the pawn on e5. This is really rather uncomfortable for white. Anand defended the pawn with queen to e2. Now, if he has enough time to play the bishop to g2 and then castle on the king side, he'll be fine. But Vaisa's next move was really very tricky indeed, and it cuts across white's plans. He played his rook to b8. Now, Anand hovered with his hand at this moment over the bishop on f1. But if he makes the natural move bishop to g2, Then as he realised, black plays the knight to c3. Fantastic move. And if pawn takes knight, then queen takes pawn. Now the rook in the corner is attacked. It can't move to b1 because of simply rook takes b1. And so the rook in the corner is lost. Of course, it's possible for white to simply move the queen, but if, say, queen to d3, then queen takes pawn check. So it's necessary to keep defending the e-pawn, but the only satisfactory way to do that is queen e3, which is really rather ugly. Black simply captures the queen, pawn takes, and white's pawn structure has been shattered. Simply a move like knight a4 would keep up the pressure on white's position. Realising that bishop g2 would land him in great difficulties, Anand played knight b3. Now he thought he'd cut out all these tactics, but in fact he fell headlong into another one. Weiser snapped off the knight, rook takes b3, pawn takes rook, and then bishop b4 check. A really surprising combination, and white is completely lost in this position. If pawn to c3, then knight takes c3, pawn takes knight, and now a couple of moves to black, but bishop takes c3 is probably best. Bishop d2 forced, then bishop takes d2 check, queen takes d2, the rook in the corner goes, queen takes a1 check, and the pawn on e5 will fall as well after queen d1, queen takes e5 check. White is hopelessly lost here. Instead, Anand played the bishop to d2, but this was also hopeless. Weiser captured on d2, queen takes d2, and then he played queen e4 check, winning the rook in the corner. Anand struggled on with queen e2, queen takes h1, but he was completely lost. He's a piece down and really had nothing to show for it. After 30 moves, Anand was forced to resign and he was out of the tournament. In the remaining first round matches, Predrag Nikolić's solid approach was too much for the colourful Kazakh Vladislav Tkachiev, and the young Israeli Vadim Milov beat Viktor Korchnoi. In the other half of the draw, Vladimir Kramnik kept his chances of winning the Grand Prix alive by defeating Judit Polgar. Alexei Vizhmanovin dealt efficiently with Matthew Sadler, while Michael Adams had a total disaster against Iceland's champion Johan Hjartarson when he lost a whole piece in the opening. Adams has a very good record playing against the Sicilian, but here he was tricked at a very early stage. d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, a6, bishop d3. Hjartarson now played a slightly unusual continuation, bishop c5, knight b3, bishop a7, knight c3, knight c6, queen e2, knight ge7, slightly unusual move, bishop e3, d6, Adams castle queenside. Now b5 came, which, as it turned out, was a very powerful idea. Adams played f4, and black kept pushing with b4. Adams put the knight out on a4, which with hindsight was a very poor move. Hjartarson played bishop d7, very tricky indeed, and Adams obviously didn't realise the danger. He captured the bishop on a7, expecting rook takes a7. But Hjartarson played knight takes a7, and suddenly the knight on a4 could not be protected. Next move, Hjartarson played bishop takes a4, and that was the end of the game. For a player of Adams' ability, a humiliating experience. Garry Kasparov's destiny lay in his own hands. If all went well, he was on course for a semi-final date with Vladimir Kramnik. The world champion was certainly on mean form in his first round match with Arbakov. This is the position after 14 moves of the king's Indian defence. Kasparov has gained some space on the king's side. This pawn on h4 is very nice indeed. It might threaten white's king. But Arbakov found counterplay on the queen side. It's a very double-edged position. Arbakov played his pawn to a4, trying to open up lines. Kasparov tried to keep things closed by pushing the pawn to b4. The knight retreated to a2, attacking the b-pawn. Now it's possible for black just to defend the b-pawn with a5, but then, for instance, bishop to b5 is possible, or perhaps rook to c1, immediately seizing the c-file. Instead, Kasparov played more aggressively. He played the knight in c5, threatening knight to b3, forking queen and rook. So Arbakov had to spend a move just protecting the b3 square, and only then did Kasparov play the pawn to a5, now that the c-file is blocked. Arbakov's next move was highly controversial. He captured the knight on c5, Kasparov recaptured. Now, in so doing, he's weakened his whole king side. Those dark squares look very weak indeed. But on the other hand, he now has a strong passed d-pawn and possibilities to attack the pawn on c5. It's a really double-edged decision. He played the knight c1. Now that's threatening to come round perhaps to d3 or perhaps to b3 to attack the c-pawn, which is very weak indeed. Kasparov played the king to h7, an excellent move. He's preparing to bring the bishop to h6, getting counterplay on those weakened dark squares. The knight came to b3, attacking the c-pawn, and then bishop h6, attacking white's queen, which moved up to d3. Now Kasparov played his queen to d6, protecting the c-pawn, but also blockading white's d-pawn, preventing white's d-pawn from moving forward. White played bishop to b5. Now, in the long run, I think white is going to be able to win the c-pawn, with perhaps bishop c6 and queen c4, has to prepare it. But Kasparov just thought, well, it's going to go anyway. He sacrificed it. c4, this is a tremendous move. Opening up the diagonal towards white's king. Now Kasparov played king g7. It looks like he's wasting time, but in fact, well, we'll see the purpose of this move in a moment. Bishop came to b5. Then queen b6 check. That's the reason why he sacrificed the c-pawn. King h1. And now black played rook h8. And this is the reason why he shuffled to the side with a king. This sets up some really crude attacking ideas. The main one being, well, this isn't a forced variation, but it just shows you the idea behind black's moves. Knight g3 check, pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn, and then bishop moves, and that's checkmate. That's Kasparov's main attacking idea, and somehow he's got to try and find a way to land with it before white actually gets somewhere on the queen side. Arbakov played his pawn forward to d6. Now let's work out what would happen if Kasparov played the knight into g3 immediately. Knight g3 check. Well, in fact, Arbakov would not take that with the pawn. He'd capture with the knight. Knight takes g3, pawn takes knight, and now he could simply block the h-file by playing the pawn to h3. If the bishop comes to f4, threatening bishop takes h3, then d7 blocks the diagonal, and if queen e6, threatening rook takes h3, then pawn takes bishop, queen. So now the pawn on h3 is indirectly defended by the queen on c8. So rook takes queen. And then bishop d7, attacking black's queen. And again, indirectly defending the pawn on h3, saves the day for white, and indeed he remains a piece up. So matters not at all clear. Kasparov is trying to land this enormous cheapo down the h-file, but Arbakov in the meantime is a pawn up on the queen side and looks very strong. Kasparov played bishop to e6. Arbakov just dropped back with his bishop. He realises it's very important to get rid of that light squared bishop. Kasparov exchanged. He was relieved that he could now capture the pawn on d6. Then came rook a to d1, queen e7. Now, it still looks as though Arbakov is doing very well indeed on the queen side. That pawn on a5, permanently under attack from the knight on b3. But then again, this bishop on h6, still very dangerous indeed, running around the dark squares. So, extremely double-edged position. Arbakov played the queen to b5. Now I think that's a mistake because it allowed the bishop to come into e3. I think it would have been better to cover the e3 square with perhaps rook d3. Now came rook d7. The final mistake. Arbakov has overlooked Kasparov's grand cheapo here. Played knight g3 check. Now, if pawn takes knight, as we've seen already, pawn takes pawn is checkmate from the rook on h8. Instead, Arbakov had to play knight takes g3. Then came h takes g3. So if rook takes queen, then rook takes h2 is checkmate. So h3 is forced. And now Kasparov played a very simple move. Queen to e6. I think that's the move that Arbakov must have overlooked. And now it's impossible to defend against rook takes h3, pawn takes rook, queen takes h3, checkmate.
The tournament began with so many surprises, and my only hope was not to continue it, I think I paid my contribution for the surprise in London, the full amount.
The quarter-final clash between Anatoly Vaisa and Vadim Milov was a nerve-jangling affair. Vaisa won the first game with black in fine style, but then threw away the second with a simple blunder when he only needed a draw. In the shootout, Milov won the toss and selected the black pieces. After 33 moves, he'd won a pawn and had a time advantage. And remember, playing black, a draw from this ending would be sufficient for him to go through. Suddenly Milov has won a pawn. Vaisa had a lot of pressure, so Milov a pawn up, and well, he's got 30 second time advantage. So Vaisa, draw's not enough for him. Maybe if he could possibly draw this position, but it won't be enough. He's got to win this, but he's in a desperate situation. Now, what can he do? Well, that's a curious move. Instead of moving his rook, he just attacked black's rook. Now he's fishing around with that knight. You never know. The knight's attacking a pawn. Maybe it can come to c4, but I mean, I can't believe that Milov is in any trouble here at all. He's just got to keep moving quickly. The knight checks. So Vaisa's king has got... Milov just in total control here. He's snapped off another pawn. Okay, Vaisa got a pawn back, but still, it's looking no problem at all for black. Problem is, Vaisa's king can't move across the line of that rook, so Vaisa's king in a very bad position. Oh, that's a desperate move, g4. Now that there's a pawn can be taken on the side. Vaisa having to move his king back just to defend the pawn. Milov hesitating slightly. Oh, remember, if it's a draw, black goes through, so Vaisa has to move the king back to the back rank, but that's a dreadful position. And now Milov moving the knight in. It's looking nasty. So Milov a pawn up and got a good position. Vaisa's king trapped on the back rank. He's checked with the knight. The king coming up the board. Now the discover check. Can that do anything? Looks reasonable. But now the king is off the back rank. That's not too bad. And Milov, his time is now ticking down. Maybe he's making a bit of a bungle here. He's a pawn up, but it's all going to be down to the time now. Terribly complicated position with rooks and knights, but it's going to be down to the time. Whoever moves quicker. And now Milov, he's moving too slowly. 25 seconds left. Now Weiss are hesitating. They can't hesitate here. They've just got to move. Now that's a tricky move. He's pinning the knight. Now, well, surely he can just take the pawn. He's done it. So pawn's now even. But I'm not sure the position matters. It's just down on the time. 20 seconds left. What's Weiss doing? He's got to just move. Time critical now. Position doesn't really matter. 13 seconds left. Oh, Weiss is not going to do it. He's got no time. Milov, he's got a time Weiss. But Weiss is doing his best to drum up some chances here. Try maybe some mating chances. But no, Weiss, he's going to lose on time. That's it. 2 seconds left of me. 1 second left. It's got to be over. 10 seconds to 1 second. Oh, Weiss is knocking the piece over. That's not really fair. Milov, 5 seconds, 4 seconds left. How did he do that? He's got to move. I don't believe it. Milov's lost on time. A tragedy for Milov. How could he lose such a game when Weiss had only 1 second on his clock for the remaining few moves? It's extraordinary. Let's look at the closing moments again. Milov played his knight to g5 check, and Weiss played the king to f5. Now Milov finds his king in a bit of trouble. Rook h1 mate is threatened. So he brought his rook over to h4 to defend. It looks a bit clumsy though. It's almost pointless analysing this position, but White has some very interesting possibilities here. Perhaps knight to f7 check. Weiss actually found rook to g1, also a very dangerous move indeed, threatening rook takes g5. And now here, I think Milov was anxious that he didn't actually allow a mate in one move, and that's why he used up his remaining time. In fact, he found an absolutely brilliant move, brilliant defence, but his time had run out. He found rook f4 check, which forces king takes rook, and now black plays knight to h3 check. And when the king moves, then knight takes rook. And because of the passed a pawn, then black ought to have a winning position. A disaster for Milov, but a popular result for the Parisian crowd, who were backing their champion, Weiss. The Nikolic-Smirin match also went down to the shootout. Predrag Nikolic has made a living out of playing the French defence, and Ilya Smirin is not one to back down from a challenge. We're ready for the final game in this match. Smirin, white, has 6 minutes. Nikolic has black and 5 minutes. But remember, if the game is drawn, then black goes through. So extra pressure on white, but white has an extra minute too. So Nikolic playing his favourite French defence. We can see we got that locked pawn structure. White's pawn on e5, giving him some space. Perhaps he can launch an attack on the king side. But Nikolic playing his moves very quickly indeed. If we look at the clock times, yep, still about a minute between them. Smirin hesitating now. Nikolic has played his moves very quickly. He's obviously confident with the system that he's using, but it looks a bit passive to me. So look at the clock times there. Smirin's time 5:23, Nikolic 4:40. So still a time advantage for Smirin, but he's just taking his time now. Now, what do you think about? Surely he's going to move that knight out of the way to f1. I mean, that looks like a natural move to clear the path of the bishop and also swing the knight round to the attack. I mean, Nikolic has castled very early in this game. That's unusual in the French defence. Smirin played the knight to f1. It's unusual for Nikolic to castle so early in the French. He's committing his king. But he's played f5 and he's managed to... And Smirin has exchanged off the pawn on e5. So now we've got a fairly typical position where black has that weak square on e5. Now Smirin plays pawn to a3. Now that's just preventing a knight coming into b4. So we've got a fairly typical position here. Nikolic, bishop to d7. Well, that's a very crude move indeed from Smirin. What he wants to do is plonk the queen on d3 and then drum up some kind of mating chances. But Nikolic, he's moving very quickly. He's not fazed by that at all. Not worried. Knight coming to e5. That looks very good. Nikolic retreated with the knight to e7. That looks strange to me. Ah, that's the classic French manoeuvre. The bishop coming around, that bad French bishop coming around to e8. Now he's hoping he can move it maybe to a more active diagonal, but boy, he's taken off that knight. Now the knight can't move, queen check, but he's played the bishop into g6. Smirin moving the queen back straight away. So Nikolic has, I think, gained from that little exchange there. Now he's managed to get the bishop from c8 to d7 to e8 round to g6. So he's exchanging off his classic bad French bishop. And Smirin now having a think. He's not quite sure how to continue. That little flurry of exchanges though, I'm not sure how well it's worked out for white. And now Smirin has less time than Nikolic. Remember, he started out with a minute more, and Nikolic moving very confidently, very quickly indeed. Bishops exchange, and there's a threat. Knight takes pawn is threatened. Smirin going on the attack. Queen coming out, threatening the knight and the pawn on e6. Now, what can Nikolic do? Surely move the queen over. Right, so he's defended both the pawn and the knight. But Smirin's got a bit of an attack. Bishop d2. Now perhaps he can move that bishop to b4. Oh no. Then the rook would take the pawn. Rook coming to c4. That's very nice indeed. So Nikolic counter-attacking well. The knight coming to h5. That's dangerous. Can Smirin somehow break through on the king side? But Nikolic very solid indeed. That's a nice move. Just aiming the queen now, aiming at the pawn on f4. b3. Attacking the rook. It's just trying to drive it away from attacking the f4. Well, I suppose he could move into e4. No, he's gone down to c2. That's a nice active square for the rook. Queen coming down to d1. So the queen retreating. Rook is attacked. Nikolic bringing the other rook over to defend it. Well, this looks like it's worked out very well indeed for Nikolic. White's attack seems to have burned itself out. Smirin glancing at the clock, just hesitating there. He doesn't look terribly confident. g4, that is a wild move. What a wild move. And Nikolic going in with a knight. Smirin has left his king, is very exposed indeed, but he's still going for the attack on the king side. But that g4, that looks too dangerous. Nikolic moving the queen to g6, that's a nice move. And that rook still on c2. This can't be correct. This looks much too dangerous. Nikolic, just over 3 minutes. Smirin 2.5 minutes. This g4 move is very risky indeed. And Nikolic has moved the queen down to d3. The queen has come into d3. That's a beautiful square. And now look at Nikolic's pieces. He's moving in for the kill. The rook on c2, the queen on d3. Smirin's move g4 has rebounded on him. It doesn't look good. Nikolic's queen right in the heart of the position now. Queen on e3, beautiful, pinning the rook. This looks dreadful for white. It looks all over. Bishop coming back to e1 to defend the rook. But this is fantastic. Rook c1, beautiful move. Nikolic playing smoothly here. That's a beautiful move. And Smirin, he's in deep trouble. How to get out of that one? He's shaking his head. He's resigned. This is the position that Smirin resigned in. he's completely lost. If rook takes c1, then rook takes c1. Now the queen's attacked, must move, say, queen e2. Then rook takes e1 check is the absolute end. This was a classic game from Nikolic. That manoeuvre, bishop to d7 to e8 to g6 to get rid of the bad French bishop. Then he dominated the c-file, and finally he entered the empty shell of White's position with his queen, and that was the very end. Would it be third time lucky for Vizhmanovin? He'd been beaten by Kramnik in Moscow and in London, so was eager to put the record straight. This all-Russian clash lived up to expectations. This is the position after 15 moves in the first game. A tense situation has arisen. Kramnik, playing white, has beautifully placed pieces. The rooks stationed in the middle, the knights, and the bishops as well. On h3 and h6, in particular that bishop on h6 could contribute some kind of attack. But how does he break through? Vizhmanovin has these strong pawns on d5 and f5, preventing any kind of break. But Kramnik found a beautiful idea. He played his queen to b3 on the same diagonal as black's king on g8. So the threat is e4, f takes e4, and then knight takes e4, and because of the pin, then the knight can't be captured. Not unnaturally, Vizhmanovin played his king into the corner, but now Kramnik played e4 anyway. It's an amazing move. Vizhmanovin captured with the f-pawn, and then came knight takes e4. Now, the big question is, can that knight be taken? Let's have a look at it. If pawn takes knight, then a beautiful follow-up move, not queen f7, but knight to e5. The threat, of course, is knight f7 check, as well as knight takes d7. So the knight has to be captured. Knight takes e5. Then d takes e5, which opens up the line of the rook on d1 towards the queen on d8. The queen must move. Well, can't go to c8 because of the bishop on h3. It could go to c7, but in fact the best move is probably queen b8. Then comes queen f7, crunch, threatening queen takes g7 mate, of course. And now if rook g8, then queen takes e7 recovers the piece with a winning position. And if queen takes e5, then a nice winning move. Rook takes e4. If queen takes rook, then queen takes knight mate. And if queen f6, then rook takes e7 wins. If queen takes rook, then bishop takes knight mate. If rook takes rook, then queen takes queen. And if the queens are exchanged, then black must lose a piece as the knight on g7 and the bishop on b7 are attacked simultaneously. Playing the queen to c7 is no better. Queen f7 comes anyway, and if bishop f8, then queen takes c7, or rook g8, then rook d7 wins on the spot. Vizhmanovin thought for some time in this position to convince himself that the sacrifice was correct, and then played king to g8, a very strange move, walking back into the path of the queen on b3, but necessary in order to cover the f7 square. Kramnik has a beautiful position. His forces are centralized and black's king is exposed. Moreover, there's little connection between black's queenside forces, for instance the rook on a8 and bishop on b7, and the other side of the board, the king side. So all in all, a fantastic position for white. He played his knight into the beautiful square e5. Vizhmanovin did not capture this because that would open up the line of white's rook on d1, and also give white a nice pawn on e5 that could spearhead an attack. Instead, Vishwanathan played the knight into f5. Now, Kramnik played this very positionally indeed. He, instead of capturing the knight on f5, which was quite possible, he simply retreated the bishop to f4, just supporting the knight on e5, giving him a strong point on e5. Vishwanathan played rook f8. Then came knight takes d7, queen takes d7, and Kramnik plonked that bishop on e5, a beautiful square. Rook f7, and again, Kramnik played very positionally. He retreated the knight to d2. Now he wants to bring it around to f3, just looking at that e5 square again. Then came c5. And already I think Vishwanathan has actually done very well indeed, just to get back to this position. He's really fighting very hard. Kramnik played the knight to f3. And the queen came to c6. Now this is discouraging white from capturing on c5, because that would open up the diagonal for the queen and the bishop, which could be very dangerous. There's possibilities of d4 opening up the line for the queen. Kramnik retreated the bishop to f4, just making way for the knight to come to e5. So Vishwanathan had to cover that bishop to f6, but that allowed bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, isolating the pawn on f5, so it's slightly weak now, but also further exposing black's king. The knight came into e5, forking queen and rook, so the knight has to be captured. And now this looks fantastic for white again. Rook takes e5, and it's those dark squares around black's king that look so weak. And around this point I thought, well, this must be winning for white. Surely there can't be a way out for black. It just looks too dangerous in the long run. But Vishwanathan defended brilliantly. Played rook e8, just exchanging off one pair of rooks. Every piece that he manages to exchange off, then that'll lessen white's attacking chances. Queen e3, just swing the queen over to the attack. Rook takes e5, bishop takes e5. Now, opposite colour bishops have a reputation for being very drawish, but when there are a lot of pieces on the board, queens and rooks, then in fact they give very good attacking chances, because that bishop on e5 cannot be exchanged off. This is the real problem. In an ending, they can give drawing chances for the defender, but when one side is attacking, opposite colour bishops can be lethal. Vishwanathan defended well though. He played his pawn to h6. That's an excellent move. That's just covering one of the dark squares on g5, but also giving his king some room on h7. Queen f4, king h7. Kramnik played the queen to h4. It's around about here that he begins to drift. Really, he needs his rook to enter into black's position, but he doesn't manage to do that. The queen came to g6. Only now did he play rook to e1, trying to get it into black's position. But Vishwanathan played queen g5, and suddenly white's attack seems to be disappearing. I think this whole queen manoeuvre, queen to f4 to h4, was a mistake. He should have tried to get his rook in earlier. In this position, he could retreat to h3. I think that would be his only remaining chance to win the game. But I think by this stage, he's actually lost the initiative. Kramnik made a pragmatic decision and just entered the endgame, where he perhaps has a slight advantage, because that bishop on e5 is still very strong. But really, the worst has passed for Viswanathan, and he managed to draw this game fairly easily. After that great save from Viswanathan, there was a quick draw in game 2, which took the players into the dreaded 6v5 shootout. Viswanathan won the toss, and like all the players, elected to play black, since in the event of a draw he would go through. After 49 moves, things are looking promising for Viswanathan, and with a rook takes a2, he goes a clear pawn up in the ending. Don't blink, or you'll miss the action. Won a pawn. Now that passed pawn on b3 supported by the bishop. It's got to be winning. Surely. Is it just a question of time? Minute and a half left. Oh no, he's blundered the pawn. He's blundered the pawn. The rook's got to move, and then rook takes pawn. So Kramnik has got the pawn back. Viswanathan can't believe it. Oh, that's a tricky move. No, he took the pawn instead of the rook. Rook comes down. But, well, it looks even. Surely, it looks like a draw. It's got to be down to the time, though. It's only the clock that matters now. The position looks so dry. I mean, I can't imagine anything can happen here. They're just shuffling their bits back and forth. They've just got to move as quickly as possible. And Viswanathan, it's in blitz. It's a big advantage to have the clock by your right hand. Kramnik hesitating, and now time's evening up. Kramnik doing his best to get the knight in, try and find some play, but Viswanathan's position is just a fortress, surely. Just shuffling. Oh, Kramnik trying to get his king in. Viswanathan defending successfully. Checking. Now, if the rooks are exchanged, maybe that'll help. No. Viswanathan, can he get his rook down to attack the pawns? He's exchanged off. What's going to happen? They've got a king and pawn ending. Oh, but it's winning for white. Kramnik has reached over and got a queen. Black's king must go back. Viswanathan exchanged off. He thought it'd be a draw. But this is a clear win for Kramnik now. Black's king must retreat. Viswanathan, he's just playing out the last few moves, but that's it. The king's in. It's over. Viswanathan resigned. Let's go through the denouement again. Kramnik is trying hard, but he's still a long way from penetrating with his king. Viswanathan should simply move his rook down to a2 to create some counterplay. But instead, a simplifying combination catches his eye. Rook takes b5 check, king takes b5, bishop e8. However, he found that after king c5, bishop takes c6, king takes c6, he was actually in a lost king and pawn ending. There's nothing he can do to save the game. Problem is, it's this pawn on g6 that is just too weak. Black's king can do nothing to stop white's king coming in. The game finished king f7, king d6, king f8, king e6, king g7, king e7, and now the black king is forced away. King g8, king f6, king h7, king f7, and here Viswanathan resigned, because if king h8, king takes g6 is a very simple win for white. Gaz's King's Indian once again proved deadly, this time against Johan Hjartarson. Hjartarson played a sharp system, but it backfired badly. He played the knight to f3, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4. Now this move order is to avoid Kasparov's Grunfeld defence, which he might possibly have played. d6, d4. So now we're back in a normal King's Indian. Black castles, and now h3 is the very sharp system that Larsson has often used. But Kasparov has a lot of experience playing against it. Knight a6. Kasparov won a very famous game against Kavalek a few years ago, where he sacrificed a piece brilliantly in exactly this system. Bishop g5, c6, bishop e2. Now the standard move e5. Of course, this pawn can't actually be taken. Well, it can, but it doesn't lead to very much. If pawn takes e5, pawn takes e5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, knight e5, and after rook e8, black is doing fine. Instead, Hjartarson closed the centre. That's the correct move. Kasparov booted the bishop back. Bishop came back to e3, but now, possibly, that h-pawn will be a target. That's why he moved the bishop out to g5, to tempt that move. Kasparov captured on d5, c takes d5. Played the knight out to h5. Now the threat is clear. The knight wants to come into this beautiful square on f4. And also, he might be thinking about playing the pawn to f5. Hjartarson reacted by playing knight to d2. Attacking the knight on h5, which came into f4. Threatening g2. Hjartarson retreated the bishop to f1. Looks a bit gloomy, but actually, he's ready next move to kick the knight away with g3. Kasparov's other knight came into play, c5, threatening knight d3 check, which Hjartarson stopped with knight b3. Short made an interesting suggestion at this point. That was to play the queen to b1 to cover the d3 square, and then kick the knight away with g3. That's a possibility. But he played knight b3, and instead of exchanging off, Kasparov played the pawn to b6, supporting the knight on c5. That's a strong move. Then g3, forcing the knight backwards. Looks as though white is doing pretty well here, but that knight on c5 is annoying. It's blocking the c file, and it's putting some pressure on e4. So, yeah, a little bit irritating. Then queen d2, threatening the pawn on h6. So the king came up to support the h-pawn. Then bishop e2, and the knight had to go all the way back to f6. It looks as though Kasparov is just going backwards. Well, he is, but it's actually not that bad for him. The e-pawn is threatened. Now, if white plays something like f3, then the knight would just go straight back to h5, and that's very embarrassing for white. Because if the pawn comes forward, then there's a pleasant choice of going into g3, or, more likely, f4. Very nice move indeed. Now, that knight is looking very powerful on the f4 square, and if that's taken, then it opens up the line of black's bishop on g7. It's an absolute monster piece now. Of course, white can capture this pawn, but really, this is, for one pawn, it's worth it to open up the line of this fantastic bishop on g7. So Hjartarson has a slight problem. How should he defend this pawn on e4? Well, he decided to capture the knight on c5. The problem is, this allows b takes c5, opening up the b file. And black has excellent play down the b file now. White played g4. This is the big idea behind the h3 system. You get in the pawn move g4, which clamps black on the king's side. Remember, the big freeing move for black in the King's Indian is f5. When I say freeing move, it's often the move that breaks white's centre apart and the prelude to an attack. But g4 is clamping down on that completely. So black must look for counterplay on the queen side. Rook b8, taking the open file. And now f3. I'm not sure about that move. I think it's better to really keep some cover for white's king. Bishop d7. h4. Looks as though white's attack is really developing quite nicely, but Kasparov now played an excellent move, quite a surprising move, but very powerful indeed. Instead of allowing white to stomp forward, he played his pawn to h5, and now amazingly, he's taken the initiative on the king's side as well as the queen's side. If white captures on h5, then knight takes h5, and white's attack is completely blocked. As well as that, the knight, as we saw before, might later on be able to hop into the f4 square. It's very dangerous indeed. Alternatively, if the pawn pushes on to g5, well, the knight just retreats, and white has completely blocked the king side. Black's king is totally safe, and black has a free hand to attack on the queen side. Meanwhile, the pawn on g4 can sometimes be taken. Hjartson played bishop g5, but Kasparov got out of the pin very easily by playing queen a5. And then white played rook g1, defending the pawn on g4. It's fairly miserable though. And now rook b4, we can see that black's counterplay is developing really very quickly on the queen side. There's a threat sometimes even to play the rook into d4, but of course the obvious idea is just to double on the b-file. Hjartson's next move was born out of frustration. His king is in trouble, he's not quite sure where to put it, he hasn't got a safe place to go to. He hasn't got any obvious attacking tries. He's in trouble. He took on f6. Kasparov naturally recaptured, bishop takes f6. And now Hjartson took on h5, but this attack looks really futile. And in fact, this was just a clear blunder, because after bishop takes h4 check, Hjartson obviously overlooked this intermediate move. Then he's actually loses material by force. If king d1, then rook d4, only move bishop d3, but then c4 wins. So he had to play king to f1, but then came bishop h3 check. Now there's only one move, rook g2. So he loses material by force. Instead of capturing the rook immediately, Kasparov craftily just recaptured the pawn, opening up the g file, which he can now use for the attack. King g1, bishop takes g2, king takes g2, and now rook g8 check. White's king is in desperate trouble, there's no way out. King h1, now bishop g5, that's a nice move. Just putting the bishop back on a good square. Hjartson sacrificed a pawn, it all comes to the same thing. Bishop takes f4. Queen c2, and now a nice winning move from Kasparov, very simple. Just bringing the queen back to d8, and now there's nothing that can stop the queen coming out to h4 on the next move, delivering checkmate. Another brutal King's Indian victory. Hjartson was obviously demoralised after this game, and he went down just as quickly in the second. Kasparov was now guaranteed his semi-final matchup with Kramnik.
Tomorrow, it's a real final tomorrow for you.
Yeah, for me, that's why I came to Paris. Yeah, it's a day of judgment.
This match was the crunch. It was now clear that it would decide the outcome of the whole Grand Prix. Not only were Kasparov and Kramnik playing for a place in the final and a chance to win the $30,000 Paris prize, but the $50,000 Grand Prix bonus as well. Kramnik was white in game one and, as in their New York matchup, he avoided the theoretical battleground of Kasparov's King's Indian by playing 1 e4 and 2 c3 against the Sicilian. After 17 moves, a balanced position was reached. Kramnik has so-called hanging pawns on d4 and c4. Will they be a strength or a weakness? Kramnik is threatening to play the pawn to d5 immediately. If pawn takes pawn, and white wins the knight on c6. Kasparov decided to defend against this by playing the knight back to e7. But this allowed Kramnik to develop a very dangerous initiative by playing his pawn to g4, a very surprising move, but very powerful indeed. Of course, the bishop must retreat to g6, and then came knight e5, a superb square for the knight. Kasparov played the rook to c8. I think that move is a little bit automatic, because now Kramnik leapt in with pawn to d5. This pawn break opens up lines for white's pieces all over the place. For instance, the queen on e3 is now looking down towards the pawn on a7, and also the e-file will be opened up, opening up the line of the queen down towards the knight on e7. If black captures on d5, then white recaptures with the pawn, opening up the line of the rook on c1 down towards black's queen. Kasparov preferred to keep the position closed by playing the pawn up to b6, and now if Kramnik wants, he can win a pawn by playing pawn takes e6, pawn takes e6, knight takes bishop, knight takes knight, and queen takes e6 check. But after the king just nudges into the corner, black actually has reasonable counterplay here, because the knight can come in to perhaps the f4 square, and white's king is slightly weak. Instead, he pursued the attack with pawn to h4, threatening h5, winning the bishop. And here, Kasparov really buckled under pressure. I think it might have just been okay for him to play the pawn to h6, but instead he played f6, allowing knight takes g6, knight takes g6, and now pawn takes e6. So Kramnik now a pawn to the good. Of course, Kasparov could play knight takes h4, but I think this would just be too risky. The knight is out of play for a moment, and that pawn on e6 is going to generate some tremendous attacking chances. Kasparov's next move smacked of desperation. He played the queen to e5, allowing Kramnik to exchange off into an endgame where he was a clear pawn up. He now took on d8, rook takes d8 check, rook takes d8, and now a very strong move. In order to support that pawn on e6, he must get the bishop into the game. So Kramnik played the pawn to c5. Now that's a great move. Kasparov played the rook to c8, hoping perhaps to win a pawn. And Kramnik again played a really powerful move. Played rook to d1, not bothering with that pawn. Now if rook takes c5, then rook d8 check, knight f8, e7 wins on the spot. Alternatively, if b takes c5, then rook d7, threatening the pawn on a7 and also hoping to shepherd the e-pawn home. And if c4, then this can just be taken. And now we have a very similar variation to the last one. Rook takes c4, rook check, knight f8, and e7 wins. Kasparov played his king over to f8 to try and stop the e-pawn. And now Kramnik captured on b6, but I think if he'd played the rook to d7 straight away, he'd have won the game. If b takes c5, then rook f7 check. Now if king e8, then bishop b5 check wins instantly. And if king g8, then bishop c4, threatening the deadly e7. If rook takes c5, then rook f7 check is still very strong. If king e8, then simply rook takes g7, just hacking off some more pawns. And if king g8, then rook takes a7, threatening rook a8 check. If black plays as Kasparov did in the game, with knight to f4, then white wins by playing rook f7 check. If king e8, then bishop b5 check wins again. And if king g8, then bishop c4 wins. For instance, if rook takes c5, then e7 is a lovely winning move. Kramnik captured on b6 first, though. Kasparov recaptured, and only then played rook d7. Still looks very strong, but now we see the difference. Kasparov played knight to f4, and c4 is no longer available for white's bishop. Kramnik sank into a big think here, and the best he could come up with was bishop to d3, allowing knight takes e6, then bishop takes h7. So Kramnik's still a pawn up, but it's really very difficult to win this one, because the knight came back to this lovely square on f4, bishop e4, rook c1, key h2, and now rook c3, threatening not only the pawn on a3, but also rook to h3 check, and then rook takes h4. With little time on his clock, Kramnik now decides to compromise. He played the pawn to f3, gave up the a-pawn, played h5, the knight came back to e6, and after rook d6, Kramnik offered Kasparov a draw, which he accepted immediately. Black may simply play knight g5, and if rook takes b6, then knight takes f3. Material is level, and the position is barren. In game 2, Kasparov could make little impression with the white pieces. Indeed, if anything, Kramnik had a slight advantage when the players agreed a draw. The young Russian had already proved his strength in these shootouts, and was clearly confident that he could take out the world champion again. When Kasparov lost the toss and found himself playing with the white pieces in the 6v5 shootout, he knew that nothing but a clear-cut win would gain him the revenge that he so desperately craved against Kramnik.
Must win. And he's repeated the Slav defence again. Whipping out the moves. Kasparov is exactly the same opening. Now, who's going to come up with the first improvement?
Queen e2.
Queen e2 is the new move. Knight e5. He's captured on g6. That knight has gone on e5. There we go. Nigel, is this still hot theory? Do you remember this from your preparations?
I've forgotten everything.
Oh no. Come on, I want a bit of insight.
Amnesia.
Rook coming to d1. Queen out to a5. Kasparov the first to pause here. His time ticking down. One blitz game to decide it all. Who goes through to the final? Kasparov 5-10. His time ticking down. Kramnik 4:53. So the time's evening up now. Kasparov glancing across, shaking his head already.
Perhaps Kramnik intends to swing his queen over to h5. Who knows? The idea of
He's played the pawn to h3. So he's offering the pawn on c3. I'm sure
he
won't be
take
taken.
No,
The queen will be trapped very quickly.
Rook into the centre.
Oh, he's learned his lesson. It's gone to d8 straight away this time. So what's the big idea behind h3?
He doesn't want to get back rank mated.
Well, it's true, but it's rather long term, isn't it? Rook coming to d8. The Slav, such a solid opening. I mean, I'm amazed that Kasparov actually went to, and look at him, shaking his head. He's not happy, and his time ticking down. He's now got less time than Kramnik. 4 minutes, 10 seconds. Let's play the bishop out to d2. Now what? Knight to d5, knight to b6.
Rook e8 can be considered.
He's played e5 straight away. Breaking open the centre.
Well, Black is very comfortable here, in my opinion. Very comfortable game.
Kramnik, he's so calm under pressure. Kasparov really not looking happy.
He's got the onus of having to win this game.
Bishop dropping back to e1. Kramnik captures on d4. Kasparov recaptures with the rook. I mean, one always speaks about the advantage of the two bishops, but
with the bishop on e1 is not doing too much.
Indeed.
And one thing which we perhaps haven't mentioned in the Slav here is that this square on b4 is a weakness, and it's well occupied now by Kramnik's bishop.
That's a strong move. The knight coming to b6. So Kramnik threatening to trade that really important bishop off as well as exchanging rooks. So that looks very strong indeed. Kasparov, I think he must trade rooks here and then move the bishop back if he's going to get anything. But that looks very comfortable indeed for black. No, he's dropped the bishop back straight away, which allows Kramnik to isolate the e-pawn. This looks fine for black.
Of course it is.
Rook e8, queen d3.
Threatening queen takes
Queen g6. Knight blockading. Beautiful blockade of pawn on d4. d5 knight very strong in the center of the board. This is really very comfortable for black. Kramnik's got to be happy with this. And if we look at the times, Kasparov, just over 3 minutes. Kramnik's 3.5 minutes.
How is it a5?
He's played it.
Oh dear. That's unpleasant.
That's a very nasty move.
It is.
So, if bishop a5, then knight takes d5. And if the queen goes back to, well, c7, then I think there's a knight takes d5.
That's right. And if queen d8, knight takes d5 anyway, will win some material.
Oh, that's nasty. Kasparov's found something.
So queen b6 was a...
Queen b6 is a mistake. Now, knight takes d5. If black plays knight takes d5, then bishop takes d5. Bishop takes d2, bishop f7 check. Basically, it's going to wind up, I think, with white winning a pawn. There we go, knight takes d5.
Yes.
And now bishop takes d5. There's also, he can also play bishop takes and queen takes g6.
Oh, maybe even stronger.
He's played it. And now,
even stronger.
Now queen takes g6. Kasparov has won a pawn. Queen can't be taken because of the bishop. Knight comes back. And now the queen, probably g5, f5, simple retreat. There we go, queen to f5.
Kasparov looking good.
Kramnik just played g6 there. Queen coming to d6 to defend the knight on d5. Kasparov is a clear pawn up, but his time ticking down. a6, that's a good move. He's trying to create weaknesses on the queen side. Playing g3, it's a safe move. It's good. Rook c1, pressurizing the pawn down on c6. Rook e7. Kasparov in control here.
h4.
King g2. Now, queen takes d4 is threatened. And also the pawn on a6. 2 pawns threatened. Kasparov moving the queen across. King's moves back from g8. There was a threat to push the pawn to d5. But what's he going to do about the pawn on a6? Moves the rook to e1. Wants to trade pieces.
He's got exploiting the weakness on f7.
That bishop on b3, bearing down on the pawn on f7. King comes across to f8 to cover. Now, what happens on knight takes a6? What's this?
Queen c4.
Queen c4. Threatens mate and the knight. Queen d5. So, Kasparov still a pawn up here, but tricky technically to win this.
Well, perhaps not, because he's going to get an outside pass pawn on the king's side.
But he's only has a minute and a half left, and Kramnik 2 minutes 10. So Kasparov, his time ticking down. That knight, a very tricky piece. This is not easy to win with such limited time.
F4 is threatened.
F4 is a big threat now. Had to play it. Knight dropping back. Now the knight can blockade in d6. That's very healthy. I think Kramnik's position has improved. That knight looking good on d6, just blockading. And now king to f6. And his knight coming to e4 to attack the pawn. Kramnik fighting hard. Pawn on d5 is threatened.
What is this?
Knight check. Knight to d7 check. Kasparov still has a strong position. That outside pawn on H4 looking good. But he's under a minute. He has very little time. So, level material now, but Kasparov still has an excellent position. The king centralized on D5. But Kramnik with definite drawing chances now. Knight coming to E4. I think Kramnik's going to do it.
He's trying to eliminate this pawn.
I think Kramnik's going to draw this.
I'm not sure.
Knight coming back to E4.
I'm not sure at all.
Knight D6 check. Now Knight C4. Oh, now Kasparov, he's played brilliantly. He still has control, but he only has 40 seconds left to try and win this. Takes one pawn. But that B pawn is just going to steam down the board. Can Kramnik stop it? If Kramnik can sacrifice his knight for that pawn...
He can't. He's going down.
The pawn going on.
He's going down.
It should be a win. But Kasparov running out of time. Only 30 seconds left. Can he checkmate? He's a queen up. It must be a win, but he has so little time left. Kramnik defending bravely. But now the pawn's gone. No. Kasparov can win it. He has little time, but it's an easy win. Kasparov wins. Brilliant.
A wonderful performance from Kasparov, who was so determined to get it right here in Paris. But right at the death, if Kramnik hadn't blundered his knight so quickly, would the world champion have been able to checkmate with just the few seconds he had remaining? Who knows? By comparison, the Nikolic-Weiser semi-final was something of an anticlimax. In spite of the support of the home crowd, a nervous Anatoly Weiser was convincingly beaten in the first game and failed to capitalise on a promising position in the second. Result, Nikolic moved through to the final. In the 1993 World Championship match between Kasparov and Short, most of the media were clamouring for Nigel to play the French defence. The first game of the final was a taste of what might have happened if he had. Kasparov playing white, Nikolic with the black pieces.
He's obviously prepared against Nikolic's French defence, his favourite French defence, and he's played the knight C3. Bishop B4, E5. Now, Nigel, you've played the French for many years, but you didn't venture it against Kasparov. Is this move the reason why you didn't? Queen G4.
It is one of the reasons why I didn't venture it. Kasparov had spent months and months and months preparing for this in the World Championship match. And so I didn't see any...
Ooh, this is really sharp.
This has been played...
Very sharp. White sacrifices a pawn. And if you notice, Black's king is on F8. This is a speciality of Nikolic's.
Didn't they had this already somewhere. What was this? This is a very recent game. Exactly this variation, yes.
Uh-huh. But this is a speciality of Nikolic's after Queen G4 a few moves ago to play King F8, defending the G pawn.
Mm. So Kasparov has sacrificed a pawn. Has a pretty dangerous initiative for this.
There's one idea, is to push the pawn all the way to H6 to weaken the dark squares around Black's king. And the other idea, of course, which is we can see on the telestrator, Rook up to H4, attacking Black's queen. And Black's queen is actually very short of squares.
Mm. Knight takes E5 looks like the critical move.
Knight E5, this is very dangerous indeed. So Kasparov whipping out his moves. He's obviously prepared this in great detail. Pawn to H6, that's very dangerous. Weakening the dark squares around Black's king. Kasparov going for it, right from the word go.
This is really why I didn't want to play this stuff in the World Championship.
Yeah.
A very dangerous initiative here. A lot of home preparation, and it's just so easy to walk into some problems. I don't know how is the position objectively, but
Kasparov loves the initiative.
He does.
Very good with it. So it's got to be a risky choice from Nikolic. They played earlier in the year in New York. They played in the semi-final then. And Kasparov, bundled him out. He won the match 2-0 with really very little difficulty. Now, what can Nikolic do here? It's a very, very uncomfortable move to have to meet h6. You can see that bishop being marked out by the telestrator there. The dark squared bishop. He's hoping to bring that piece into the game. He's advanced the h-pawn right up the board, so he's trying to chip away at the defences round black's king, and then later on move the bishop in. But of course, Kasparov has sacrificed 2 pawns to get to this position. So a very double-edged situation. Okay, Nigel, black to move. Oh, he's taken it.
This is a surprise.
Bishop takes h6 check. Black's king is open.
This move I find quite astonishing, in fact. Because now if king e8, bishop
g7,
bishop g7 is winning on the spot.
Here, Nikolic is in big trouble. He's obviously walked into some home analysis that Kasparov had done for last year's World Championship match against Short. His king is in check. If it moves to e8, then bishop g7 wins. The rook in the corner is attacked as well as the knight on e5. And if knight takes f3 check, g takes f3, and the rook is still attacked, and now the queen on e4 is also attacked. King g8 is therefore forced, but it's such an ugly move to make. The rook on h8 is now trapped in the corner, and black's king is potentially in a mating net with that bishop on h6 just cutting it off. Kasparov's follow-up was really powerful. He played his rook to b1. Now that prevents black from moving the bishop to d7 because the rook takes b7, and also prepares to move the rook up the board to b4 and possibly to swing it across to the king side into the attack. Nikolic attempted to plug a few holes in the king side with knight g6. Then came rook b4. Then knight takes f3 check. G takes f3. Queen had to move back to e5. Now you might think that Kasparov's king is in just as much trouble as Nikolic's, but in fact it can rest very safely on the f1 square. There's really nothing that black can do to attack it. So Kasparov just continued with his offensive. f4. Now queen c3 check, and the king came to f1. No danger at all there. Now there are threats, for instance, to play f5, just breaking open black's position. So Nikolic felt forced to play f5 himself. Then came rook b3, queen went back to f6, and now c4, trying to break through into black's position. If Kasparov can break through, then it'll be decisive. That bishop on h6 is going to assist in any mating attack. It's really powerful, and Nikolic can't dislodge it. He attempted to get his bishop out by playing b6. So he gave up the pawn on d5. Then bishop b7. So now there's a pin by the bishop. If the pawn moves on d5, then the rook in the corner drops. Rook d3 came, so that now if bishop takes d5, then rook takes d5 is possible. Very simple, but very attractive win. Queen takes d5 check. Nikolic brought the rook over, It doesn't really help that much. And Kasparov played the rook to g1, just tying black up even more, and of course getting out of the line of the bishop on b7. Nikolic played the pawn to b5. Well, I suppose he's perhaps trying to prevent a bishop getting to c4 eventually, but it's really an irrelevance. D takes e6 came. Rook takes e6. Now a winning move. Rook d8 check. King f7 is forced. And now rook d7 check. Of course, if the king moves backwards, then the bishop can just be taken. And even after Nikolic blocked with a rook, Kasparov just snapped off the bishop. Rook takes b7, and here Nikolic resigned, for if rook takes b7, then queen d5 check, forks king and rook. A total rout. Needing to win with the white pieces in the second game, Nikolic has forced Kasparov into an ending where black has to be extremely careful of the advanced a-pawn. White should now rush his king over to try to support it. Instead, Nikolic hesitated for a moment and played h3, a move that lost time and weakened his kingside pawns. This gave Kasparov the opportunity to bring his king over to try and blockade the a-pawn. King to c8. And only now did Nikolic bring his own king over, king d3. King b8, king c4, and now king a7. I'm sure Kasparov felt much more secure now that his king is blockading the a-pawn. And here, Nikolic played very bravely indeed. He moved his king forward to b5, into the heart of Kasparov's position, but that allows Kasparov to free the rook and get into Nikolic's position. It's extremely double-edged, but Nikolic had to go for this. Very brave try. King c6, and now rook b3. Now we can see one of the problems with this h3 move is that it's weakened all the kingside pawns. They're just lined up, ready to be taken. It was perhaps best for Nikolic just to lunge in straight away with king d7, but instead he played the pawn to g4 first, just to save some of the pawns. Then came rook takes f3, captured on h5, and now Nikolic brought the bishop in to a5. This threatens bishop b6 check, driving back black's king. And of course, if king takes a6, then bishop b6, or any other bishop move, is mate. But Kasparov wasn't fazed by this. He continued snatching pawns on the king side. He'd calculated precisely that he could come back and defend. Bishop b6 check, and now king a8. This looks terribly dangerous for black, but in fact, it seems as though there's no way that white can bring the rook behind and deliver mate on the back rank. Nikolic played bishop d8. And now if Kasparov defends with the obvious bishop f6, then king d7 creates problems. Instead, he found the crafty bishop e5, allowing bishop takes e7, and then rook g3, a very clever defense. So now if bishop takes d6, then rook g6 wins a piece. It's now not clear how Nikolic makes progress. He tried to bring his rook in the game with rook to a5, king a7 and rook b5. Now there's no need for Kasparov to get involved in the complications after king takes a6. He played rook g8, a powerful move, preventing the white bishop cutting back into the attack with bishop d8, also perhaps threatening rook h8 and h4, h3. Again, Nikolic had no obvious way to continue. He could check on b7, but then simply king a8. And how does he make progress? Nikolic picked up the rook and hovered with it in the air, uncertain where to play it. In the end, he plumped for rook b3, but this is a clear mistake. Kasparov pushed his c-pawn. Nikolic moved to the side, but now the attacker's gone. Kasparov marched on again. Nikolic tried to prevent it, but the pawn kept going forward. And now if rook takes c2, rook c8 check wins the rook. And so in fact, after the pawn went to c2, Nikolic resigned.
C'est extraordinairement défendu dans cette position. Ça semblait critique, il a trouvé une très jolie manœuvre avec tour g6 pour défendre le pion d6.
Alors, quelle est la signification de ce dernier coup? C'est assez étrange.
Ah, il push le pion C maintenant.
Parce que maintenant, c'est le festival des pions noirs plutôt que du pion blanc.
Ah, il a une position passive maintenant. Sa tour est très passive en 1-3.
C'est toi, tour à 2, peut-être que ça... Quand même,
Il va
si c'est
revenir,
passif,
ouais.
C2. Il peut jouer C2. Oh là là.
Pourquoi? Ah oui, parce que la tour noire arriverait. Si on prend, ah oui, c'est super.
Aïe, il est perdu. Regardez, tour prend C2.
Échec de la tour noire.
Échec, et on gagne la
capture
tour.
la blanche.
Oh là là.
Quel drame. C'est fini. C'est fini, il a perdu.
Ouais.
Il a
Abandon.
It's very dangerous. But you know, it's not simple. This is a bad move because that most h3 is a bad move. Yeah, but it's not clear. Bishop a5 from that. But I take check and king a6. It's not easy to, bishop b8. Yeah, but then bishop f6. Bishop takes
Champion du monde, Garry Kasparov a gagné la deuxième partie du match.
But this is a very strange idea. This is, I played only.
When the Grand Prix points were tossed up, Kasparov had overtaken Ivanchuk and Anand and was equal first with Vladimir Kramnik. The miracle had happened.
Vainqueur du premier Grand Prix Intel de Paris, Garry Kasparov, champion du monde.